Before Five Nights at Freddy's became one of the biggest horror franchises in gaming, it was just a small independent project from developer Scott Cawthon. In the summer of 2014, Scott uploaded a short trailer to promote the game on Steam Greenlight. At first glance, it looks almost identical to the version millions of players would eventually play, but if you slow the footage down, frame by frame, something strange starts to appear. Several moments shown in that trailer never appear in the finished game. Some are small animation differences, others are entire screens that seem to have existed only for promotional footage. Whether they were created exclusively for the trailer or removed during development has never been fully documented, but over a decade later, they're still some of the most discussed pieces of pre-release FNAF media. One moment in particular has fascinated fans since 2014. Near the middle of the trailer, Bonnie appears on one of the cameras and lifts away part of his face, revealing this metallic endoskeleton underneath. If you have played Five Nights at Freddy's, you'll probably recognize something immediately. This animation never happens during normal gameplay. No known version of the original PC release contains this exact sequence, and despite years of players searching through the game's files, nobody has ever discovered a hidden trigger that recreates it. Exactly why this scene exists is less clear. One possibility is that it was rendered purely for the trailer to create a memorable horror moment. Another is that it represents an early animation that simply didn't survive into the finished game. Scott Cawthon has never published a detailed breakdown explaining its development history, so its original purpose remains uncertain. That uncertainty is part of what keeps the clip interesting more than 10 years later. Over time, many fans noticed something else. Bonnie's exposed endoskeleton in the trailer bears a visual resemblance to Withered Bonnie, introduced in Five Nights at Freddy's 2 only a few months later. There's no evidence confirming that one directly inspired the other. Still, it's easy to understand why the comparison became so popular within the community. Sometimes, the most memorable pieces of lost media aren't important because they are explained, they are important because they never were. Bonnie taking off his head isn't the only moment that stands out. If you slow the trailer down, you'll catch another strange sequence. For just a few seconds, Bonnie can be seen sprinting down the hallway toward the office. It's a dramatic shot, but it's also one that players never experience in quite the same way during normal gameplay. In the finished game, Bonnie's movements is shown through a series of camera changes and room transitions rather than a cinematic run towards the players. Whether this sequence was created specifically for the trailer once again, or it reflects an earlier stage of development isn't publicly documented. Either way, it becomes another small reminder that the version of Five Nights at Freddy's shown before launch wasn't a perfect match for the ones players eventually downloaded. Looking back at it today, the original Five Nights at Freddy's trailer feels less like a perfect snapshot of the finished game and more like a glimpse into the development itself. A version of FNAF suspended somewhere between prototype and release. Not completely different, but not completely finished. Just different enough that years later, fans are still discovering details hiding in plain sight. If the trailer gave us a glimpse of a version of Five Nights at Freddy's that no longer exists, the promotional screenshots raise even more questions. Long before millions of players were playing Five Nights at Freddy's, Scott Cawthon had already begun showing pieces of the game online. Some appeared on Steam Greenlight, others were preserved through archived websites and promotional material. Taken individually, they don't seem unusual, but viewed together, they tell a story of a game that was still evolving almost until release. At first, the differences seem almost insignificant. A font looks slightly different, an icon appears to be positioned elsewhere, or a camera that has been renamed since the pre-release footage. Individually, none of these details prove very much, but game development is often written in details this small. Every archived screenshot becomes another snapshot of a project still finding its identity. The environments themselves also appear slightly different. Some pre-release images display noticeably different lighting and contrast compared to the final release. Whether these represent earlier render passes, promotional adjustments, or artistic experimentation isn't always possible to determine from surviving material alone. What we can say is that the atmosphere wasn't entirely locked in from day one. Even small changes in brightness can completely transform how frightening a room feels. Looking back, it's tempting to think of the original release of Five Nights at Freddy's as a single finished product, but these archived screenshots suggest something different. Not a completely different game, but a project constantly being refined. Textures shifted, interfaces changed, animations evolved, and little by little, the version shown to the public slowly became the versions players would finally experience. And this wouldn't be the last time. As the series grew, Scott continued revealing pieces of games before release. Teasers changed, character designs evolved, entire mechanics appeared in promotional material before disappearing or returning years later in a completely different form. For longtime fans, hunting these differences became almost a game of its own. One played not inside Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, but inside the history of the franchise itself. For millions of players, Five Nights at Freddy's didn't begin on Steam. It began on an iPhone, maybe an old iPod Touch, maybe a budget Android device, maybe a hand-me-down tablet that struggled just to keep the game running. To many fans, that was FNAF, but the version they remember isn't the version you can download today. When Scott Cawthon first brought Five Nights at Freddy's to mobile devices in late 2014, he wasn't simply copying the PC game. Smartphones at the time had far less memory and processing power than most desktop computers. To make the game playable, compromises had to be made. Some animations became shorter, others were simplified, visual effects were reduced, and certain parts of the experience work noticeably different than their PC counterparts. These changes weren't necessarily mistakes, they were practical solutions. Every frame removed, every animation shortened, helped the game fit onto devices that, by modern standards, were incredibly limited. Players at the time often accepted these differences without question. After all, most had never ever seen the PC version. Some of the most memorable differences weren't visual at all, they were technical. The jump scares that played out were delayed, and the animatronics stayed in the screen long after the screen was finished. Because of the limited processing power, the phone had to run this all at once, meaning all the jump scares took longer to execute. Years later, everything changed. Beginning in 2019, Click Team started rebuilding the classic games for modern mobile devices. These weren't simple updates, many of the original compromises disappeared, higher resolution graphics returned, animations became more faithful to the PC releases, menus were redesigned, and numerous bugs from the early ports were fixed. But that improvement came with an unexpected consequence. As the remastered versions replaced the originals, the first generation mobile ports quietly disappeared from digital storefronts. Today, if you download Five Nights at Freddy's on a mobile phone, you're not playing exactly what players experienced in 2014, you're playing a rebuilt version. The originals survive mostly through old devices, archived installation files, gameplay recordings, and the memories of the people who played them. In a way, the mobile versions that introduced an entire generation of Freddy Fazbear's vs. Pizza have become historical artifacts themselves. Whenever people think about Five Nights at Freddy's, they usually imagine Freddy Fazbear, Bonnie, Chica, or Foxy, but in many ways, the story of FNAF doesn't begin with a bear, it begins with a beaver. In 2013, Scott Cawthon released Strippers and Son Number Co., a family-friendly game about woodland animals. It wasn't a success. Some players commented that the characters looked unintentionally unsettling, less like friendly mascots and more like lifeless animatronics. Scott has since spoken about how that criticism helped inspire the idea behind Five Nights at Freddy's. Rather than fighting those comments, he leaned into them. Looking back now, it's easy to see why fans draw connections. The stiff poses, the glossy eyes, the expressionless faces. They are not identical models, but you can almost watch one creative idea evolve into another. Sometimes, the biggest breakthroughs don't come from success, they come from failure. When people hear the words lost media, they usually imagine unfinished games, cancelled movies, or projects that disappeared before anyone even had the chance to experience them. But sometimes, lost media isn't something that was cancelled. Sometimes, it's something that simply changed. The original Five Nights at Freddy's trailer captured moments that never appeared in the finished game. Archived screenshots preserved versions of the interface that he felt before release. The first mobile ports introduced millions of players to a variation of FNAF that has since been replaced. None of these discoveries rewrite the story of the franchise, but together they tell a different story. The story of how one indie game slowly became the phenomenon we know today. What's remarkable isn't just that these pieces of history still exist, it's how they survived. Not because they were officially preserved, but because fans archived websites, saved trailers, backed up old game files, and documented tiny differences that most people would never even notice. Without that effort, many of these moments would have disappeared forever. Over the past decade, Five Nights at Freddy's has become one of gaming's most analysed franchises. Entire communities have spent years comparing files, preserving old builds, and debating every hidden detail. Ironically, that dedication has also preserved the history behind the games, not just the lore, but the development itself. It's one of the reasons the franchise remains so fascinating after all of these years. Maybe that's the real story behind FNAF's lost media. Not that it was forgotten, but that someone else was always there to remember it. Some games leave behind sequels, some leave behind memories. Five Nights at Freddy's left behind an archive, and even now, more than a decade later, people are still searching through it. As always, if you enjoyed exploring the forgotten history behind Five Nights at Freddy's, consider subscribing for more deep dives into gaming hidden stories, and if there's another game, mystery, or piece of lost media you'd like me to see me cover next, let me know in the comments. Until then, thank you for watching, I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.